Project Sapient is a podcast meant to engage our brothers and sisters in the law enforcement and military communities in conversations that we all know we need to have. All opinions you hear are our own, and they are protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. They are in no way reflect or are meant to reflect the opinion of any specific agency, officer, or service member. Some opinions may be controversial. Listener discretion is advised. Enjoy. All right, everyone. Project Sapient's back. Jake's not with us today because technology just didn't decide it wanted to work with us today. But it's actually a very special episode. Been trying for, feels like almost 10 years.
It's been a long time.
Yeah, trying to get you on the show, and you just happened to move into Boston, and I'm like, you know what? Let's do it.
Yeah.
Now we got to do it.
Yeah, and in person.
And in person,
Yeah.
exactly. So this is actually Project Sapient's first in-person interview, as you can tell with all the wires everywhere,
You handled
and
it very well. You got an excellent.
so it's interesting. But I'm really excited, Kate, to get you on. So I'm going to do a quick intro for those waiting to figure out who Kate is. Here's a quick intro and bio about Kate. So Dr. Kate Pate, right?
Mhm.
Okay, you correct me. You're like, nope,
As
it's not
easy
Pat.
as possible.
Yep. All right, Dr. Kate Pate is a PhD neurophysiologist, coach, and entrepreneur with extensive experience in scientific research and practical applications in the military and soft community. Her doctoral work focused on respiratory neurophysiology, exploring the brain-breath-body connection, and later expanded into to include trauma-informed yoga and meditation for the military. Kate's postdoctoral research centered on redox biology related to inflammatory diseases, including traumatic brain injury, personal and professional interest due to her own experiences with head injuries. She transitioned from academia to industry, becoming a program director for combat casualty care research, driven by her connection to the special operations community through her brother. As the founder and CEO of Karuna Medical, she develops innovative medical devices for austere environments with funding from the Department of Defense and the National Institutes of Health. Kate's passion for helping service members and veterans with complex health issues led to her to pursue training in transformational recovery, psychedelic integration, and functional medicine. In addition to her medical work, Kate is dedicated to environmental conservation, hunting, mountain sports, and helping underserved. He's pursuing a graduate degree in theology to further support the spiritual health of those she helps. Like, wow. I mean, that's
You could have just said she is. Yeah, just it works in the community or something. I feel like
no. Well, I think it's so. You've done a lot, right? And you
Yeah.
do a lot for the veteran community. You know, if you want to just kind of go into some of the work you've done, especially with TBI, and what you found over the years that you've been doing this. I mean, you know, just for context, I was in 2005 when I was in Iraq. So for us, TBI was still foreign. Like it wasn't never even mentioned.
Right.
All of a sudden now, much later in years, they started talking about TBI. So if you want to go over kind of how that all came about.
Yeah, well, and for folks from the earlier years and the GWAT years, I mean that it wasn't talked about very often, and so now it is an issue, right? We're kind of it's a known at this point. So people are paying attention when they're on active duty, when they get, or even in in law enforcement, the breacher community, people are paying attention now to when they might get some eating some charges or whatever, shooting a Gustav or whatever it might be in whatever scenario or environment you're in. But back then, it was part of like the normal training, normal exposures in combat. And so people weren't mentally tracking that stuff. So you look back and you're like, well, I'm sure I was exposed to blasts pretty regularly, but I honestly don't remember because I wasn't mentally tracking it at the time. It wasn't a known thing. So for a lot of people from like the earlier years, I mean, I feel like for many, they kind of assume, and probably rightly so, but then there's like an unknown quantity or amount, and so it is really challenging for folks who have likely been exposed, and maybe greatly so, but just don't have the evidence for it because they weren't paying attention at the time. It's a shame.
No, I mean, my run-in with TBI first time ever was when I came home. I decided, let me jump into college right away. So jumped into college, and it's funny the before and after when you learn about TBI. So before, GPA was like 3.5 and above, and I was like one of them photographic memories, and I could just, like a parrot, basically regurgitate whatever I read. And when I came back home and then decided to jump right back into it, my GPA dropped to like a 1.9. I almost flunked out of college completely.
Right.
And I was getting so pissed off and frustrated, like, what the hell's wrong with me?
Yeah.
And that was really the first time where I was like, you know what, I need to get checked, see what the hell's going on, because this is not the norm.
Yeah, it wasn't for lack of effort. It was just like your brain isn't working the way that it used to, and you can't focus, and you're not retaining information, and it's really challenging. And my kind of interest in this, or foray into TBI research, really started when I was really young. I loved brain. I was just a nerd. I loved brain stuff. I loved neuroscience. I used to read like neuroscience for dummies when I was like 8 years old. But I was really interested in that. And then one of my older brothers got a really bad concussion from racing motocross. And that was my first experience with anybody directly. And I saw how it impacted him. And I was really curious around that. And then as I got older, I got really interested in various sports and horseback riding and mountain biking, skiing, snowboarding. And I started having my head injuries of my own, a number of them. And some, when I was younger, didn't quite affect me so much. But I had a really bad accident in 2016, mountain biking in New Zealand, and had a gnarly concussion, a bunch of sutures in my face. And I was teaching at a medical school in Colorado at the time. And trying to come back from that and teach, I was putting PowerPoints together and it wasn't making sense to me. And this was stuff I was supposed to be an expert on. And I'm looking at these screens and I'm trying to remember what all of this means. And like, I'm having to read a paragraph 10 times. And just all of that was really frustrating. So that was my direct experience with it. But at that time I had already studied TBI and so kind of knew what was happening, and was trying to do all the right things for myself to put things into place to recover well, which at the time, it's like, just because you have the knowledge doesn't mean you're going to do what you're supposed to do.
Exactly.
So I am guilty of that for sure. But I had studied, backing up a few years, during my graduate work and into the postdoctoral years, I had opportunities to study neurotrauma, spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. And looking at, you mentioned redox biology, it was this balance of oxidants and antioxidants in the body that can often contribute to inflammatory diseases, essentially. Neurotrauma being one of these processes that involves inflammation that can go awry over time. And we're really interested in looking at therapeutics to kind of shut down inappropriate inflammatory response in that long-term part of the injury process. So that was a lot of the work that I was doing as a postdoc, was traumatic brain injury and spinal cord injury work, looking at different therapeutics to try to mitigate these inflammatory cascades that lead to long-term problems. So because we were doing drug discovery research, we couldn't publish on anything, because if you publish, then you can't get a patent on, where it is that you're, So unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to present or publish on a lot of that work, but there's a lot of promising data that came out of that work, and that those therapeutics were taken forth into cancer and radiation biology research, and they're in clinical trials now. So eventually, if they get approved for cancer and radiation mitigation, maybe at some point they could be used off-label for TBI research. Maybe they could be used for a clinical trial.
So
I don't know if that's
without trying to like pry too much. I get the whole patent thing. Is it just because big pharma wouldn't want something like that? Because you know how the VA is with their rainbow pills that they throw at veterans.
Yeah.
Is it something like that could hurt the big pharma industry?
It's not so much that as much like as ultimately you would want, I mean, I hate to say this, but ultimately you would kind of want like a big pharma to pick it up because they're the ones who have the money to take it forward. You know,
Gotcha.
I mean, it's really difficult to do this work without deep pockets,
Yeah.
but they will never pick up a drug if it won't be profitable.
Yeah.
Even if it could cure every disease on the planet.
Yeah.
You know, it's like if they can't make money off it, they won't take it forward. And so to make money, they have to have IP, you know,
Yeah.
intellectual property secured, patents around it.
Yeah.
So for us developing a new therapeutic, you want to wait and get as long of a patent life as possible. So you kind of push off publishing for a while till you file your patent.
Gotcha.
And then once you file the patent, you know, that the clock starts ticking basically.
Gotcha.
You've got to get to a point where you've got good clinical data for
Yeah.
somebody to come pick it up and to get forward. So
Okay.
it's a complex process, and it's really unfortunate that it works that way.
Yeah, that's I mean for the layperson, I say, I guess just, you know, people like me, just like, you know, so much red tape for, let's say, an obvious answer. You know, like, you know, instead of, you know, doing what you typically do, a veteran comes home and then they go see the VA. The VA says, you have PTSD and TBI. That seemed to be like the go-to. PTSD and TBI. Here's a bunch of pills and good luck.
Yeah.
You know, like pretty much it. As much, I mean, not to knock the VA too much. I mean, they've done great strides, but they're missing a lot of stuff compared to when I first went to the VA back in 2008. Is when I finally pulled the trigger and went to the VA, and it was an awful, awful experience. And I walked away, and then went back after a friend of mine, more like in 2020. Actually, during COVID, just before actually 2019, he told me to definitely go back because it's completely changed compared to what we know it as. And yeah, and I was impressed with some of the things that they're doing. But
they're
again,
trying to think outside of the box,
exactly.
but it's a big behemoth, you know. Yeah. It's just difficult.
It's the bureaucracy of,
it is.
You know, of the whole thing. So kind of shifting gears though, I know when me and you, we spoke a while ago and how you, from your work in the veteran community, the soft community, you started seeing more first responders, right? Mm-hmm. Law enforcement, firefighters. Yeah. And you started kind of, I say, like doing a correlation almost like, oh shit, they pretty much have the same issues, just different operating theaters, so to speak. So can you go into like a little bit of what you've been noticing and working on? Yeah,
and I'll tie it back into the TBI stuff because that was really what led my work there, and then teaching at a medical school, and then you described the kind of trajectory of my career, and then working for this combat casualty care research program. It led me into the space of operational medicine, we'll just say. And that, it's obviously applications for the military community, but also applications for first responder communities as well. And going to Special Operations Medical Association meetings and things like that, I was starting to see and meet lots of people from the first responder community because they were aware of the research that I had done in the background, with TBI, and some of the other things that I had done. People in these communities that I was crossing paths with just started to open up a little bit. They were like, okay, well, she's not associated with the unit that I'm a part of. She's not a psychologist or a mental health clinic. Like, I'm not going to be therapized. Yeah. People were like, okay, but I could talk to her about. And so I think I was kind of a safe space for people to just open up to naturally.
Gotcha.
So people would say stuff about TBI. Like, I'm pretty sure I got blown up, or I definitely did. And now I don't know what's going on, but I'm not okay. And I don't really know where to go. I don't want to go through the traditional channels for all the reasons you mentioned.
Yeah.
But I don't want to get yanked from a team. I don't, there's all these barriers to seeking help.
Yeah.
And so people started reaching out to me, and then that led me into this world that was unknown at the time, besides my just limited knowledge of TBI. I was like, I don't know what kinds of things you guys are dealing with. You got to like explain it. And so I just started to become a sponge, and I was like, what's going on? What have you experienced? What have you tried? What have you not tried? Let me dive into the mental health literature. I did not know much about mental health when I started this process. I mean, it was Like even if somebody had asked me back then to define PTSD, I couldn't have given them the criteria, which I think most people even diagnosed with it aren't told what exactly it is.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. So I started educating myself as best I could on everything that my friends were facing. And that was when I started seeing these corollaries between the different communities. And yes, the operational environments are different. The stressors are a little bit different in different ways. Like, I think a lot of times people traditionally would say like, oh, first responders don't have it as bad as like military service members. And I would argue that they do in other ways. Like, I mean, definite. There's so many things that I think are so much harder for people in the first responder community and law enforcement, especially, but the fire service as well, and EMTs, but law enforcement in particular. And I think that gets overlooked, and it's another layer of stress. So I often would see these symptoms of, you call it stress overload, but I call it operational allostatic overload, which is also kind of the term for that in the soft community is operator syndrome. People may be familiar with that. But I like to redefine it in physiological terms because it makes sense then. And also, I don't want people to identify with it, like something like PTSD or depression of like, am this thing, or I have this thing, it's a part of me. It's like, well, no, it's describing a physiological process is how I like to frame it, rather than like a thing you have. It's just a physiological process.
It's what happens inside, like in your body. Exactly. That way you don't get 100 people saying, I got allostatic overload.
I'm just like, man, that wasn't the goal.
No, it completely get that. So, I mean, now that we're bringing it up, that's part of the things I wanted to talk to you about. So with allostatic load, so for everyone else, can you just explain that, in your own terms, like what it is? And yes, it's not a diagnosis. It's just what happens physiologically with you, when you're going through trauma, whatever you're going through.
Right. Yeah. So normally our bodies are trying to manage all of the stressors that are kind of bombarding us at once. And it does that through learning. I mean, our brains are prediction making machines, and our bodies are trying to manage energy and predict what's happening next to be as efficient as possible and to manage all these stressors. It's always doing this. And that's how our nervous system is wired. And it's a good thing. So our normal state of like kind of balancing all of that is called allostasis. So maintaining allostasis is kind of what we're all seeking, the ideal situation. And then allostatic load is anything that's causing, like putting a load on that system. So a stressor, really. And we are really adaptable and we can handle a lot. And so our bodies are constantly being pushed and pulled in different directions. And we're kind of, bouncing back and managing energy and all of that. So allostatic load is kind of a normal part of living. And for most of us, we kind of get pushed or pulled in a direction. You can think about it like a pendulum, even though it's more like three-dimensional. But, say you get pushed by a stressor and you swing out. Ideally, you'd want your stress response system to kick in and come back to baseline. And then you get hit again, and maybe you get hit twice and you kind of bounce a little far, but like you have the ability to come back to baseline, recover, regenerate, recuperate, all of those things, build up that energy budget again, for your body. Most people in this profession, in the first responder profession, and also in the military, what happens is there's so many different types of stressors bombarding, physical, environmental, psychological, that you start to push somebody out, and as they swing back, they get hit again. And then they swing back and they get hit again. And that could be a traumatic brain injury, a lack of sleep, illness, one of your children are sick, or you're potentially sick, or financial burdens, your career's in jeopardy. All these things keep pushing you out. So it doesn't have to be just a physical stressor. The psychological ones also impact the same. It's one system that we have. So it keeps pushing people out. And when you get out here in this arena so far from baseline, it's like leaving your air conditioner running in Death Valley with all your windows and doors open.
So
the wheels are going to come off the bus. Like you cannot operate that way for an extended period of time. There's going to be breakdown. There's going to be dysfunction. And that's the point where people like operator syndrome, right? It's like you look at the list of symptoms and there's all these dysfunctional systems. that's the point where you're having breakdown. And I see that in the first responder community so much. And in a first responder community, it breaks my heart even more because people in the law enforcement and fire service and EMTs, like, it's not as much of a norm to talk about it like it is in the veteran community.
Yeah.
And I've found working with folks when I was living in Montana and now here, people, the stigmas are real. And the barriers to opening up and talking are so much worse in these communities.
Yeah. The thing is, though, it's because it's our careers, right? So unfortunately, the way it would work is the minute, I mean, it's just like anything. Oh, anyone have any issues? You raise your hand and all of a sudden now you're out of work for however long. And that could be a career ender.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of guys and gals have this passion, this drive in the first responder community that they can't let go, or they think that they're not good at anything else because now my job just told me I'm no good. So that's one of the reasons of the stigma behind it. And if you think, with the overload, I mean, you're talking, like I work in a medium-sized city. So I could see maybe anywhere between 1 to 5 traumatic type scenarios, in a week.
In the place that you live.
In the place that I work and in the place that
you're gonna be driving past these areas on a regular basis.
Yeah. So versus, when I was at war in Iraq, I'm not going to have the same reactions because I've been there, in decades. So over here, we drive by the same exact places where I could tell you exactly where a kid died. I could tell you exactly.
Can't help but think about it.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about it, like you said, over and over again, or you just dealt with, let's say an infant who's dead. And then right away, you got to get right back out to work. It doesn't matter, because there's another call waiting for you. And you go to another call, and it turns out to be just BS, let's say property dispute. 2 neighbors 30 years ago, and this is like true story. 30 years ago, the guy before who bought this house placed his shed 3 inches over the property line, and now you have to remove it. This is real. This is actually, I'm like, really? But anyway, so you deal with like that debt, and then you go deal with these 2 neighbors who are going at it. 9 times out of 10, the cop is going to have this emotional response. Like, he's just going to be like, get the fuck out. Like, you're going to lose your mind.
How can you care and have compassion for those 2 people bickering when you just saw like a loss of life?
Yeah.
You're like, the scale is not the same here.
No. And that's the unfortunate part I find in the profession is there is no downtime after dealing with something like that. Especially after like homicide investigations and stuff like that, where, we were literally up almost, it felt like 30, 40 hours straight in a homicide investigation. And we'll take, after the case is resolved and all that, everyone's arrested. We'll take a day or 2, maybe vacation or take a break. But even then, there's no time because you still have stuff you got to do on the front and back end of this homicide, even though you arrested everybody. But now you got more paperwork you got to do. You're talking to the lawyers, you're talking to the courts. And so you're never done. Like one of my cases, a real bad sex crime against a child. And I had to work on that case for 2.5 years. So for 2.5 years, I had to read through the notes. I had to read through the reports. I had to look at the DNA evidence, and I had to. So you can't, like you said though, with that pendulum, every time it hits, and then you get something else, and then you get something else, and eventually, in the first responder community, they break. We break. I mean, because it's just one thing after another, and it never ends. So I could totally see how this overload that you describe really get to the first responder community. I was talking to a close friend of mine. He's a Green Beret, and he says, in his opinion, he said, law enforcement is the equivalent to like a Green Beret because it's very unconventional methods of dealing with the crowd, dealing with people, and you're out there patrolling and doing whatever you're doing. And he says he kind of equates it to that because
you're dealing with people,
exactly.
Humanity. You're supposed to be compassionate all the time,
exactly.
And understanding,
and it makes it very, very tough. And with building resilience within, one thing I want to talk about is kind of not so much the building the resilience, but kind of the neurophysiological science behind the stress and trauma. Like, when you're in that state of stress, right? let's say you dealt with a bad car accident, 3, 4 people really injured. Or actually, I'll give you a real one. I went to I was the kind of incident command for a mass casualty type incident where a car drove right into a building and hit a bunch of people. So dealing with that, and I was one of the first ones to show up. The first 2 officers showed up. I mean, everyone did a phenomenal job, right? Because you had, for me, I was more like, all right, who's the most wounded, who's this, who's that, and the fire department showed up. So it was a lot going on with that sort of, we'll call it stress and trauma, right? Physiologically, like what would be happening with me as I'm seeing all this stuff? Because I know how I am. Like on mission, I ignore everything. Like I'm on a mission, I got to do this, do this, do this, do this. But then for me, it's always after, right?
Yeah.
Where you get that adrenaline dump, or all of a sudden I'm tired. Like I just want to sleep 3 days. So if you can just kind of go over a little bit about.
Yeah, and it depends on the person, right? Because like some people get into these high stress, potentially traumatic situations, and they get fully activated and they shine and they just like compartmentalize and motor through it. And other people are completely debilitated from the get-go. So it does a little bit depend on, the kind of person that you are. But generally speaking, going into something like this, I like to talk about stress in terms of like physiology and body systems and all that. And so like as you're preparing to go in and deal with something that's potentially traumatic, you have your stress response system is kicking on already. You've got activation of your sympathetic nervous system, which is technically the fight or flight kind of more activating side of things, which is turned on to prepare the body for mobilization. So, you're mobilizing glucose stores in your body. You're preparing to expend energy. You're potentially enhancing focus. If your stress hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol get too high, it can flood the system, and that's where people end up kind of dissociating instead of being hyper focused. Like if you drank some caffeine and you're ready to go, it almost becomes something where they can dissociate, or they have a impairment of memory.
Is that amygdala hijack type?
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Yeah. And you see this in certain people who are maybe predisposed to it. There's correlations around which type of person may be which, but again, it comes down to individual factors, training, all those things. But you have essentially activation of these systems, maybe certainly heightened arousal, but maybe heightened attention as well. So it can go in either direction, but ideally you would have this activation and preparation to be able to deal with what you're dealing with. Now, when you see what's going on and you have visual input from maybe something that's horrific, emotions start to kick in. And for most people who have been well trained and exposed to a lot of these types of things, they've become very good at compartmentalizing. So in that moment, there's this information, there's maybe a split second of emotion that you realize if you let yourself go there, that you're not gonna be able to do your job. So you feel it and then you shut it down and you compartmentalize, you put whatever that is in a box up on a shelf in your brain and you just keep moving forward. And unfortunately, this is the kind of profession that demands that. It's not maybe normal to do every day of your life. It's a survival strategy. It's very effective, and I'm glad we have it because we need it.
Well, I just think of like our primal days. We had it because when a saber-toothed tiger was chasing us, that's something we needed, but not on a daily basis of running into the fire, we'll say, so to speak.
Totally. So and with that analogy, right, like it made sense to mobilize for physical things, but like emotional stress activates the same system, and it's like you're being chased by the saber-toothed tiger, but in reality you're just thinking about your ex or your finances or something, right? But the compartmentalization thing is really important. But I think what happens in this profession, in the first responder profession especially, is, and military for sure, is that you have to do it so frequently. And with the first responder community, like you said, you don't have that downtime where you're not on anymore. Like, on deployments, you've got to extend it over the period of deployment. When you come home, there may be other things that you have to deal with, but you're not at risk of getting shot at. And, like it's a different scenario. So you do have a little bit of that downtime to recover. With the first responder community, you might have a day or two If you take a vacation, it's maybe a week.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you don't really have a lot of time to recover. So you're pretty much put things in boxes on shelves every day. And we have the capacity to hold a lot. But at some point, with the stressors we were talking about before and your pendulum, you know, this
Yeah.
allostasis getting to the point of being pushed into allostatic overload, that's where our ability to manage everything starts to fall apart. And
Yeah.
so now the analogy I like to give is you try to put another box on the shelf, and in the process, because it's so full, you knock a bunch off. And now you're driving down the street to go get groceries and you start bawling out of nowhere, you
Yeah.
know, and you know, like, I don't even know where that's coming from. Or you just get angry, you have rage, and you
Yeah.
don't understand. You know, it's like I had a client that was telling me, I love this. I hope he listens to these podcasts, because if he ever hears this story, he's gonna be like, that was me. But he told me the story, and I say it all the time because it's hilarious, but also very real. That he was in this point of allostatic overload, knocking boxes off of shelves. His physical function wasn't great. He was just dealing with a lot. And you know those chip bags where they have like you can tear off the pre-torn, but there's a zipper.
Yeah.
So you tear off the top, and then the zipper's there. You eat chips, and you zip it back up, right?
Yeah.
Well, his wife cut below the zipper, and he was like, "Why would you do that?" You know, like he just couldn't. He blew up. He lost it when he saw what she did. He just lost it.
Yeah.
It's a minor thing,
Yeah.
right? Like, this is not something to like. This is not a hill you want to die on.
Yeah.
But in that moment, he couldn't. It was, for him, in his defense, what was going on for him physiologically was she wasn't paying attention.
Yeah.
She's a liability. This is a risk. If she's not paying attention to detail, this could get somebody killed.
That's actually makes sense to me.
Yeah, right.
You know, right?
Yeah.
It makes sense because it's those checks the boxes that we check when we're running ops and doing all these things is
Right.
yeah, and it's funny that's what I always tell like brand new cops on the job, pay attention. The smallest detail could save your life or
Right.
could kill you, like if you miss it. So yeah, I could totally see how. But again, like you said though, when he's been compartmentalizing over and over and over, and then that little minor thing, because it happens to me too with my son sometimes, where it's just a minor thing. I get it, and I blow up, and my wife gives me the look, and then it turns into, yeah, let's go at it. But it does make a lot of sense that, you know, over the course of a week, you know, again, like 1 to 5 traumatic things, and then finally the littlest thing just sets me right off. And like you said, it makes perfect sense. But so in terms of like training that resilience inside a department, I can tell you that law enforcement does a piss poor job. There is no training other than if you're on a specialty unit like SWAT, like I am, like we train for, you know, force on force and all kinds of different scenarios and all kinds of different things. And we do a lot of stress shoots. So we get that arousal up, and it's kind of like the inverted U theory, right? Where we concentrate on a task or skill over and over and over and over. Just like, you know, I say, just like, you know, in the military, when we're doing room clearing, we'll do that till we throw up. Like it gets so boring but there's a reason behind it, right? There's a reason why we will battle drills, right? Battle over and over and over again, is that way when that arousal happens, we hit that peak performance. And that's, like you said, for me, it's kind of funny. I wear a heart rate monitor. So when I'm doing like an op or anything intense at work, I love to see where I'm at, because I can't really tell if my heart rate spikes or whatever in the moment.
Yeah.
But sure enough, you'll see like my heart rate will spike to 170, 175. And as I'm in the situation, it starts to drop.
Right.
Because I've been trained and conditioned to be able to operate in that environment. But, you know, then on the flip side, I'm like, yeah, but if you throw a snake in front of me, I'll scream like a girl and I'll run up 10 miles the other direction. Right. But, you know, in terms of, but the thing is, in the long run, like I said, they're not training the officers for any of that. Right. So like in the academy, we never talked about amygdala hijack, or we never talked about the importance of, you know, checking yourself or mentally checking yourself and stuff. And I think, you know, that's why I think you have a lot of these cops that are walking, talking disasters, because they don't know.
Yeah.
Right. They don't know what's going on. That's why
they weren't prepared well to deal with the stressors of the profession.
No.
And it's not, I mean, everybody needs to take responsibility for themselves, but when you don't know, it's not your fault, really. I mean, there's everybody needs to, like, higher up, through administration needs to do a better job of bringing trainings in and creating more opportunities for that kind of thing to help people, because it's really important. It's really important for the individual human who is the law enforcement officer, right?
Yeah.
Who is a human being. Let's remember that.
Yeah. People forget.
I know, and it's important for their well-being, but it's important for it's important for the investment of the organization, the money they've put into training that person, but it's important for the people that they're interacting with. I mean, it's of critical importance to be able to train people well and to help them and set them up for success, and to deal with these things that are they're very real physiological issues and psychological issues that we understand and can put things into place to deal with.
Yeah.
But even the compartmentalization piece, I mean, there needs to be some room for people to downregulate, to process what they experienced, whether it's a peer support specialist, or they need to just go out in nature and do their thing for a little while and process it the way that they process things. I mean, people need that room, because when you just keep shoving stuff down, putting things on boxes, I mean, there's going to be a blow off valve at some point.
Yeah.
And that's maybe an indicator that you're at that point.
That's the thing. Like with me, like I love doing ARs with my guys and gals after a critical incident.
Yeah.
We'll do a quick AAR in the morning, the next day. That way, guys think about whatever, and we'll just kind of hash through the AR and leave it at that. And I always, no matter what, I always recommend to all the officers, hey, go, if you need help, seek help. Like there's nothing wrong with it. And that shows more strength than weakness, and I always say that. And for one thing is also another factor that I see, not just, with the stress and trauma, but also burnout in the law enforcement and first responder communities. Because I was reading this study actually from the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology. Up to 90% of police officers experience symptoms of burnout at some point in their careers. Like I work in a city, burnout rate is much higher for people that work in a city, because the demands are so much on a city, and we're always understaffed. We'll never be, you're never fully staffed. And the same study found that nearly 1 in 5 police officers meet the diagnostic criteria of full-blown burnout. So those officers, all of us, officers that are out there where we're working 16 to 20-hour days even, and then going home to sleep for 4, 5, 6 hours, that's not nearly enough rest.
No, it's an unwinnable situation.
Exactly. And I've read a study, I forget where, but I read a study saying that, that sort of schedule that law enforcement has, and you're working, it's equivalent to, I think they said like a BAC level 0.1 something, like basically you're drunk.
It's I mean, it's crazy. And I don't think people understand this. Like it's really like that does matter. Yeah. And going back to allostasis, like that lack of sleep, all those stressors impact your ability to stay centered. And that, is kind of referencing some work done by Lisa Feldman Barrett. She has this theory, the theory of constructed emotion and affective realism, but she talks about police officers and law enforcement officers and how these demands and ultimately the affective state that they're in colors their perception. So for example, they did studies looking at law enforcement officers and perturbing them in different ways, basically trying to get them to experience different types of emotions, and then be exposed to like a specific scenario that would maybe be a person holding a weapon or something like that. The way our brain works, it's again going back to what I mentioned earlier, it's a prediction making machine.
Yes.
So it fills in the blank. And if a scenario based off of previous experience, whether it's really real experience you've had, things you've heard of, something you watched on TV, your brain is making predictions to be ready to anticipate what to do next. It can fill in something that looks like a gun to a person. Their perception was that person was holding a weapon. Yeah. When they really weren't. And everything that person experienced prior to that moment is playing into that person's perception of that moment.
That's interesting. So that's so I read this book, Left of Bang. They talk about perception, and I've kind of really dug and started looking research into people's perception and how when you watch a use of force type video and one cop shoots and the other one didn't, it's because, again, body cams do not give you the officer's perspective or perception. They're just showing you what
it's just a visual
is just a visual representation of what happened, not the what was actually going on in here. Exactly. There was one case that was done. I don't know if you've heard For Science. Yeah, they do a lot of studies and stuff. On law enforcement, and they were sharing this case that they worked where an officer was dark and even through the body cam, what appeared to be the guy holding what looked like a firearm. And what Force Science did is they do a great job of recreating all the things that led to the shooting. And through their analysis, what it turned out to be, the guy was holding a cell phone, kind of like a gun, but he was in like a dark corner of the backyard. And even though that the body cam enhanced the image, and you could clearly see it wasn't really a firearm, but the stance the guy took made it perception of the officer, shoot, this guy just drew a gun, I need to fire back. So it's interesting you bring that up about that perception.
Yeah, it's like the affective state, or the how you feel about how you feel, essentially, really plays into this. And that's where you're asking officers to make split-second decisions on lack of sleep and all these other stressors. And that's where I think training has a place to be adaptable for this specific thing, because I think if people could train in scenarios that put them in different affective states, when they're happy, when they're tired, when they're angry, when depressed, when they're like, if you can get people to do it in all those different ways, so that way when they show up to do the job and they're in that state, they've trained well enough to know that maybe there is that ability to take that extra second and realize, like, again, your brain is kind of filling in the blanks here, but if there's any way to insert a pause and allow somebody to really take a breath. Again, sometimes it's a very split-second decision. You don't have a second, you know? So I'm not trying to solve the problem. It's far more complex, but I want to introduce that for people to contemplate, because it is important. And the same thing with like affective states. Yeah. You make totally different decisions when you're feeling, maybe a little down versus happy. And there's tons of research on this. So this isn't earth-shattering stuff, but it is important, because the more we get to know ourselves, and when we're in a specific type of mood or feeling a specific kind of way, we know I'm in that place, I'm feeling this way, I'm probably going to make decisions this way, and maybe I shouldn't be making decisions right now. Yeah. That is also very valuable.
So that's the thing. We like to what's called like a mental health day, where we'll just not come to work. We'll call it a mental health day, and we'll just relax, because there are days, I mean, every cop feels it. There are days where you're like, you know what, I'm not feeling it. I'm staying home. Great. This is not, and we'll call it a mental health day. It's really, you take a sick day, quote unquote, and you're just like, just stay home and just relax. Because to me, I've had officers show up to work with only like maybe 2 hours of sleep. It's because of personal stressors, right? Kid's sick, this is sick, this, dog wasn't feeling well, so I had to take it to the ER. I was up till 4 and I have to be at work at 8. So by the time I got home, and I literally tell the officer, I'm like, why did you come in then, man? You're not ready. So what I ended up doing for one officer is I put the officer like on a whole, like on the other end, like, just go hide. If we need you, we'll call you. Yeah. Because to me, that's more of a liability, quote unquote, to not just to the officer themselves, but also to the partners and to the community too, because you're not thinking, right? Your mind is just exhausted by all the other things that have been going on in your life. And you're basically tired. And speaking of, you're saying like training and scenarios and stuff like that, that's one thing that I've always pushed is scenario-based training. And, I bring back to like, when I was in basic, where they give you your rifle for the first time. And whether it's cold, snowing, raining, middle of the night, it doesn't matter. You're going to be training with it. Yeah. They don't care if they wake you up at 2 a.m. You better be able to take it apart, put it together, or you better have your serial number memorized and all that. But all those things you put together, though, builds that automatic system where now you're not even really thinking about it because you've rehearsed it so much, whether you're tired, wet, hungry, you just go do it. So that's one thing where I've been really trying to push realistic simulated scenarios, stress exposure training. That way officers have some idea when they step into an active shooter, what they're actually going to be feeling.
Yeah.
Right. Some sort of, you build it, right? I mean, I always tell the story of when one of my guys I knew out in Iraq got blown up and killed by an IED. My body went into automatic mode when I was switching the radio freaks to talk to the air support and everybody else. But because it's been rehearsed so much that it didn't really take a lot of, we'll call it brain power to do it, because I just push buttons, turned a couple dials, and I was dialed in. I was good to go. So, but you always see these officers like, like I'll hear it over the radio. They're going to a call and they're screaming into the radio because they're in that panic state.
Right.
And you're like, Jesus, like, oh boy,
when it's gonna,
it's going to be a disaster. Right. So within each agency, I'd say, unfortunately, there's not that training, especially in the patrol division. They don't get that training.
I know, and the level of training is not enough for people who and people expect. I mean, it's like the general public expects law enforcement officers to be perfect, and they're human. Many don't get the training that you've had, and I think expectations are unrealistic for what the reality is of what we're giving officers, and officers need more training. And I think
that's a whole other conversation about that. Well, I mean, I write for Havoc Journal a lot, and most of my articles kind of revolve around the idea behind how training just sucks for law enforcement. Like, unless you're in a specialty unit like bomb squad or whatever else, like, unless you're doing any of those things, you're not getting the right training. You're not getting the training you need. I mean, I know patrol officers or agencies that the only training their cops get is the academy, and that's it. And maybe they'll go shoot at the range once or twice a year. And that's it.
And it's not setting people up for success.
No, and it to me, it's like you're just shoveling and pushing people out the door. Here's a badge and a gun, and go forth and
hope you do some
hope you do some good, kind of like a hope and a prayer. So it's
so frustrating. It breaks my heart for everybody involved. It's just not a situation.
No, it's not. And there's times where I've hit that load where I try to stay as in tune as I can with my body and my mind, because just over the years of learning and kind of just me being a nerd and interested in all those things, so, but it really kind of taught me a lot about myself, where I can, the next day or the day after, if I go through something and I'm extremely tired, I'm like, oh, I know what that's from. But one day I did not realize, so we had a training down in Connecticut at the range with the SWAT team, and I'll never forget, I was in the car driving and I just broke down. And 2 days prior, I almost shot and killed somebody because it was a really, really bad dude. There was a warrant out for his arrest. He's like a gang enforcer, street level type guy, but really, really bad. His threat matrix was off the charts. And, I was an assistant team leader. So me and the team leader, commander, we set up the whole, op and putting all the plans together. So you're talking maybe we worked on it for like 2 weeks prior to the day of, doing it, and all the intel we're getting and everything and putting it together. So you have all those stressors coming together, and then the day of the op, I'll never forget, it was a Boston cop. We were helping them. It was a huge roundup of gangs. It was like one of the massive ops.
Wow.
Yeah, it was like multiple SWAT teams involved. It was during COVID when, one of the good idea fairies hit the district attorney's office, and we're like, well, let's release some of the jail because that way, whatever. And they picked the worst type of people to release, not your, stole something and you can go, you know what I mean? So,
totally.
So they picked the worst of the worst to let them go, and they put GPS on it. They're like, oh, okay, that's going to really help. But anyway, so before I get into that part, so, we did the whole planning and everything. And I remember that day. So that morning, early morning, we were going through the op, briefing the rest of the team of what we want, kind of expectations and who this guy is and what, all the things. And I'll never forget a Boston cop. Usually the detectives, they'll have a thing. ready for them. Kind of their final brief, I guess, the detectives, where I'll say, "Hey, detective, anything I missed," and they'll stand up, and usually it's no, or if they have something extra, they'll give us. But the one thing the detective said was, "Just so you know, the district attorney is looking to screw a cop over. Good luck.
Okay.
Like, be careful." Like, I'm like,
That
great.
is not
And
something to say.
I'm number one through the door because I had a big rifle shield, 50-pound shield. So I'm like,
Shoot.
I'm gonna be the first. I'm gonna be the guy who's gonna shoot this dude, and I'm gonna end up in jail because this district attorney, whatever. And our percentage, I think, at the time for a shootout with this guy was close to 97%. Like he was that bad.
Jeez.
That's why we decided to take a big shield with us and just in case. And I remember we did the entry. It was early morning. Did the entry. Went right to his mom's basement. Granted,
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
lives in mom's basement. Goes right in mom's basement. He ducks out of his bedroom. I'm going with the rest of the team behind me. And I'll never forget. He was reaching to his bed. I went in the room. He was reaching at his bed. I had my gun right there. It was a Glock that he was going for, and I kept telling him, "Don't do it." And I'm squeezing the trigger, and he's like, he gave up. So it was a near, like, all I needed was maybe another half-pound pressure and see you later. But 2 days later, that's when, driving, it broke down. I'm like, what the hell is that from? But I faulted myself because I didn't work on it. Because again, as a team lead, you're like, assistant team lead, my mind was on the other guys and everything else.
You got to keep moving and handling.
Exactly.
Right.
Even after the arrest and making sure the guys are good and everyone's that. And I'll show you pictures later with a news guy. Frickin', he's a buddy of mine. He does like photography for the news. He took a bunch of pictures. I'm like, you asshole. But I'll show you the pictures of it. It was interesting, my posture, how I was. And I'm like, oh, yeah, that's definitely the stress I'm trying to relieve. Because you can see I'm stretching. I'm doing like things that
intuitively.
Yeah, intuitively. I'm not even realizing I'm doing it. And again, like, I faulted myself because I didn't really work on myself after that. I didn't realize what was going on in my head at the time.
But sometimes you don't know how it's going to hit.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, I talked to lots of friends in the military, and they had lots of experiences in combat and shooting and killing people. And sometimes it was no issue. And other times it was like that one instance, and they couldn't have known or predicted why that one time versus another really affected them. And it's challenging, and sometimes you don't know until it like crops up later. But one thing people don't understand, though, about really high stress and potentially traumatic situations is that post-traumatic stress is normal following an experience like that. It's your body saying, wow, we almost died, or that was really a close call. I should maybe be a little bit more alert for a while in case this happens again, right? It's a normal survival instinct. Now, over time, that post-traumatic stress subsides. You realize you're safe. It's in the past. The event happened and it's no longer happening. And you kind of go back to a baseline and feeling better and moving through life normally again, whatever your normal is. And for some people, it just gets stuck in that on position. And that's then what goes on to become post-traumatic stress disorder. But for most people, that initial phase of stress, hypervigilance, inability to sleep, maybe nightmares and some flashbacks initially early on, inexplicable emotion, all of that stuff can be part of your body kind of processing and letting go of what happened. But again, there's a lot that, for some people just continues. And there's just so much we don't understand about this too. I'm talking about a lot of these things that are the theories that we have when it comes to neuroscience and humans, psychology. We can't open someone's head and know exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
So, this is basing a lot of things on theories that make sense, but also everybody's a little different.
Absolutely. I mean, we've had one officer who ended up quitting right after a homicide. That officer could not handle it.
Yeah.
Completely broke down. It's still brand new to the job.
Yeah.
And as soon as they witnessed, it was quite the crazy scene. But it was enough for that officer to say, you know what, I'm all set. And which commend them for that, because might as well get it early on versus deciding to, toughen it up and toughen out and, let it creep up another time. But everyone's designed, I guess, built differently. I don't know if you find this, but within the law enforcement community, like the combat veteran seems to be a little more resilient than your average civilian police officer, like just because I think just from the stuff we've done.
Totally. And a lot of people who are drawn to the military profession in general are already a little bit sturdier, we'll say.
I thought you could say crazier. I'm like, yeah, that's
more
true
resilient
too.
is maybe another way to put it. And I mean that in a way, this is definitely applicable to the soft community for sure, but I think the military at large as well. You see a lot of people who come from really difficult upbringings.
Yeah.
You see a lot of adverse childhood experiences, and you see a lot of people who end up being able to shoulder a lot more stress later in life. Now, this doesn't mean that they're superhuman, because as I described, physiology is physiology, right? So just because somebody had a rough childhood and is able to shoulder more stress doesn't mean that it's not going to come back to affect them later in life, right? Like, pay attention to that stuff. You're not, like, none of us are superhuman. Some of us are able to handle a lot more than others. And God bless those people, because we need them. But also it can come at a cost for that person eventually.
Well, that's the thing that, yes, we need people like that, because it's an thankless job, unforgiving job. I think what agencies need to do is invest in their people. Yeah, and that's the biggest thing. And usually with cities, I always see it with these city councils, whatever. Well, what is it going to cost? And what, to them, it's all the money.
And that's the whole defund the police thing, all that bullshit.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, it destroyed the profession even more than the profession's already destroyed. But it really, really hurt the profession even more. And now, I say we're like maybe 30 years, 40 years back versus where we should be now, with all these different movements and all that stuff. But I digress before I get into that part. But so being respectful of your time, and I know you drove all the way out here, and we're in the 22 Mohawks headquarters.
Yes, which is awesome.
Yeah, and if there was something, we like to ask this for everybody that comes on the show. If there's one thing you would want, like, advice to police officer or firefighter, military veteran, something that they should do to make themselves that much better, what would it be?
That is a great question. I would say to not be hesitant or afraid to invest in yourself. I know a lot of people get into these professions because they want to serve, and they often put themselves last. But for you to be the best version of yourself at that job, but then also to be the best version of yourself to your family and your friends and all of that, the time it takes to take care of yourself, to learn about paying attention to why you do things, your patterns, and utilizing tools, whatever they may be, to move through things and to recover well, whether it's physical or physical or psychological injuries, visible, invisible, whatever it is. Putting that time in to take care of yourself, I think, is critical, because we need people who are achieving optimal wellness, who are also serving their communities and their country. And everybody is a human being at the end of the day and deserves that.
Thank you very much. And that's a huge reminder to everybody. We are all human. With being human comes at a cost when we're dealing with situations, whether it was 20 years of GWAT or every day putting your vest on and going out the door to maybe could be the last day you see your kids, or could it's you always have those things in the back of your mind when you walk out that door. For those types of people that walk out that door, I mean, it takes just courage and bravery alone just to be able to do it. So taking care of yourself, that's a huge, great advice, because can't stress that enough. But Kate, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, like that first in-person interview over at inside 22 Mohawks HQ. So everybody out there, stay safe and stay sapient.